Thank you, everyone, for making me feel a little bit better. I have a number of collaborators who have helped with various parts of this talk. I'm going to draw heavily from some of the work that my PhD, now postdoc student, Emma Harrison has worked on during her PhD, and none of this would be possible without sort of the background, sort of geomorphic history that Gilles Burckhardt has worked out about the island of Puerto Rico during his postdoc when he was at the University of Pennsylvania. So yeah, I wanted to talk to you about the dirt on soil sustainability. This talk, I guess, sort of stemmed from a freshman seminar that I taught, and it made me realize breaking down some of the parts of soil sustainability. And we were really lucky to hire, while I was at UCSD, a person who does sort of ecosystem services type work named Kate Rickey. And I was really excited to collaborate with Kate about figuring out, how much soil is worth after doing this whole freshman seminar. And I, laid out all the different things that I thought that she would need to know to run these huge models to get, how much soil is worth. And she sent back an email that basically had this photo on it. So this is a screenshot. It wasn't exactly this, but it was a screenshot from Lowe's. Here's a thing of garden soil. It's 428 for a bit less than a cubic meter of soil, and you'll see that it gets sort of medium reviews, only 2.5 stars. So people are not loving the soil here. And it makes me think about how soil is much like water or air, in this respect that you don't know what you've got till it's gone, right? The Joni Mitchell song. And so I wanted to sort of think about that in terms of what does soil sustainability mean? If we can get it from Lowe's for $4, what does it mean when we say that soil is a sustainable resource, or that we're treating soils in an unsustainable way? So let's break it down. First, there's been a lot of work on how soil erosion has been increasing in sort of modern anthropogenic times as a result of sort of European style practices of agriculture. And so there have been a number of really interesting papers written about this. I first sort of was introduced to the topic by Bruce Wilkinson when he came and gave a talk at University of Minnesota, and I've been interested in it ever since. And one of the ways that I think about it is, we always have to have mass balance. And so if we think about sustainability, there's like a lost factor, and then how fast soil is replenished. And I know that this is a little bit different from the way that people think about soil in an agricultural setting. And so I will hopefully remember to always define my terms of what I, as a geomorphologist, not a soil scientist, mean by soil. And hopefully it doesn't offend anyone too much how I define soil. And so some people also will note that what we really mean about soil sustainability is the kind of soil that grows our crops. And so that is not in my wheelhouse, let's say. So what I'm going to talk about instead is just bulk soil, because that is, of course, important as a first order. If we're interested in carbon in soil, we should also be interested in the soil itself, because the soil itself is sort of the host for where the carbon might hang out. So part one of the talk will be how fast is soil lost, and part two will be how fast is the soil replaced. So in the first part, I want to talk about, was the soil recorded by either how we've lost soil through erosion processes, or sometimes what people do is they measure what's actually been deposited and inferred soil erosion from that deposition. And then we always have to compare it to a specific time, right? So a time frame. And so one of the things that would be really important to do is not just to compare soil erosion rates with other rates in a completely different place, but one thing that might be really interesting is how fast is soil being eroded now compared to like a natural baseline rate. And so that is one of the things that I've paid a lot of attention to in my sort of research career. And so I want to bring you up to speed on some of the interesting and I think surprising things that I've learned from that. And this is just sort of this photo is just hitting home the idea that soil erosion is stripping off farmland, and that this is something that we really need as humans in order to grow food. So rates of soil erosion, this is thought to be humans affecting the land surfaces in this Wilkinson and McElroy paper in 2007, one of the most important geomorphic processes currently shaping the Earth. And so you would think that everyone would want to work on it. So that's partly true. A lot of people have worked on this. One of the things that was noted, and this is a kind of a really interesting paper about soil sustainability by Dave Montgomery in 2007 too, in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, is that if we think about agricultural rates of erosion, they can be orders of magnitude higher than soil mantled landscapes. And so this brings about the question, you know, how long are we going to actually have soil? And so to think about this in terms of soil sustainability, it brings up the question of like, are we going to replace that soil quite quickly through soil production mechanisms or not? And where do they get those measurements from? Is this rates of deposition that they're measuring, rates of erosion that they're measuring? What is it? So one of the things that is sort of my bread and butter, I have a lab here that measures cosmogenic nuclides, and these cosmogenic nuclides, if you want to read more about them, there's an elements volume, and if you write to me or tweet at me, I can DM you a link to that elements volume all about cosmogenic nuclides. But basically what it is a metric that we use, a geochemical technique that we use to understand how fast things hang out in the near surface environment on Earth. And I guess you could use it on other planets too. And one of the things that I'm going to talk about in particular, I'm going to leave out meteoric beryllium-10 today, though I like that a lot, is talking about in situ beryllium-10 production. So this is one of those cosmogenic nuclides. It's formed as a result of the interaction with cosmic rays. And you can imagine that simplistically or simply that the more beryllium-10 a soil has in it, the longer it's been sitting out exposed to these cosmic rays. So that's kind of like a first order explanation of beryllium-10. And so we can measure the amount of beryllium-10 in soil or bedrock and figure out how long something has been in that near surface environment. And that has been really revolutionary in how we interpret rates and dates of Earth's surface processes. And it's really helped us to understand long-term rates, because these rates where we derived from cosmogenic beryllium-10 really average over thousands of years. And so they're somewhat not perturbed by these changes from humans. So we can actually get natural sort of baseline erosion rates for different places, which is really helpful and useful. One of the ways that we use them is we go down to a river bar and we scoop up some sand and we extract the beryllium-10 out of it, measure that concentration of beryllium-10 in the sand, specifically in quartz. And one of the things that we do after we know that concentration N here is that over time, there is a steady amount of that beryllium-10 in a specific watershed or landscape that's dependent on the erosion rate. And so for fast rates of denudation, or weathering plus physical erosion is denudation, that we have a lower amount of beryllium-10 in that river sand compared to a place that's eroding slowly, which would have a higher amount of beryllium-10 in that sand. So the sand, you can imagine, it's sort of measuring the amount of time that those sand grains take to exit the system. So this is really a useful way of figuring out how much mass flux is leaving a specific catchment over a specific time frame. And so one of the things that people have done over the years is compare these baseline erosion rates to stream gauge sediment load. And this is just a compilation from Jake Kovalt in Journal of Geology a few years ago. And what is presented here is this solid black line is giving you the one-to-one line. So along this one-to-one line, or near it, is where the stream gauge sediment load is actually matching the long-term mass flux out of a basin derived from beryllium-10 measurements. And so one of the things that you notice is that there are areas where you have low human impact, where the sediment gauge load is actually less than the long-term erosion rate, and then some places where you have sort of high human impact, where the stream gauge sediment load is higher. And this has been published in various places, not just this review by Kovalt, and one of the things that you'll note is that these, at the time of the publication, I think these were the only places where people had sort of done this comparison between suspended load and cosmogenic rates. And one of the things that I noticed is just that, like, this is not representative of at all, but if humans are perturbing the landscape so dramatically, you know, all over the place, then what we would think is that, like, you'd see all kinds of high human impact places. And what we see is that, like, of these few that are measured, you have kind of a few that are high human impact, but then you have a bunch that are low human impact too. And so it's not obvious that every single place on Earth has actually been impacted by human-induced erosion or anthropogenic erosion in the way that we think it is. So some people don't really like these comparisons, and so I won't spend too much time on it. They think it's kind of like comparing apples and oranges. But I will say that I am able to compare apples and oranges. They are both fruit. One of them is red, one is orange. So they tell you different things, but you actually can get some information from comparing them, right? Knowing that the suspended sediment is actually not the same thing as the long-term rate of removal of mass that beryllium-10 is measuring. But it's interesting nonetheless. So another way that people measure the amount of anthropogenic or infer the amount of anthropogenic erosion is by going to places downstream of these sort of hill-sloped areas that might have been impacted by human like agricultural erosion practices. And in this Wilkinson paper, Humans, Geologic Agents, A Deep Time Perspective, it kind of gives you some sense of the accumulation in some of these big floodplains. So these rates are just crazy. I mean, they're rates that are not for sedimentation, that are not seen in terms of erosion in many places at all. And so one idea is that, you know, these low floodplain areas are kind of forming like a funnel and funneling from lots of different places around. And one thing that people have done is noted that if you look at time, and here is today, right here at zero, for these different places, the Yellow River, rivers in the UK, the northeastern rivers, the Rhine River, the upper Mississippi River over here, one of the things that it looks like is happening is that we have an apparent increase in sedimentation rate in these rivers, or in these floodplains. So you get like this sort of low rate of sedimentation, and then bam, once you hit sort of recent time, it really increases rapidly. And so this is one of the reasons that people have assumed that we're changing the landscape dramatically compared to the past early Holocene. So the way that people get these dates is that, to paraphrase the song again from Joni Mitchell, you don't know what you had when it's gone, right? So floodplains potentially could offer us a way forward in understanding fluxes of sediment over time, because this is a nice depot center, right? It's forming a basin that is locking in or sequestering sediment from different time periods. This particular one is from Puerto Rico, just downstream of the Luquillo Critical Zone Observatory in the Fajardo floodplain. And one of the things that people do, and that in fact we did in the Fajardo, is to pull some organic material, some radiocarbon datable material out of the floodplain. And then you measure how low it is, what the depth of that sample is. And if you know the age from the C14 date calibrated, then you can get a sedimentation rate. So this is one of the ways that, just to go, I guess I can't go back, whatever. That when we looked at that ramp up of rates toward times in the present, that we see that big increase in deposition rates toward the present. And this is the way that people have gotten those rates, taking some radiocarbon datable material and getting a sedimentation rate from that. So if we look at this again, here is that ramp up, here's that ramp up of sedimentation rates. But the one thing that is sort of tricky about this and any kind of measurement where you are comparing modern day rates with rates in the past is that you have a different amount of time that you're averaging over. And so this has been something that Pete Sadler here and Doug Gerelmack and Sadler have published a paper in 2007 that kind of nicely goes through the effect of this timescale difference on rates, or the effect on preserved thicknesses of anything that is deposited. And so what you see on this plot is 25,000 measurements. And Pete has even more measurements today. Every time he goes to a library, he gets a couple of more measurements. And one of the things that you'll note from this is that if we look at preserved thickness versus the time span that that measurement averages over, we see that higher rates marked by these different lines of equal rate. So this is red, a higher rate, and then we go all the way down to lower rates on this log-log plot, where rates plot as lines like this. And so what we see is that time spans that are short, if we just look at all of the data, all of the depositional data, we see that higher rates are over here by short time spans. If we look over here at long time spans, we see that we have a lower rate of sedimentation. And so let's think about this in terms of these floodplains. So are we affected by this timescale bias in floodplain materials? So here is that data plotted again from the Yellow River, the Rhine River, Mississippi River, and the Ribble River, which is in the UK. And we're plotting it against time span of averaging from the present. So the reason it's not time, right, is that if you pull a carbon datable material from depth, what we actually get is the entire time interval from when that was particular piece of carbon or macrofossil or whatever was laid down to the present. So the present is at the surface, and we are averaging that entire time span by using the sedimentation rate from the surface down, right? So if I'm just normalizing here these rates so that they kind of all plot together, and what we can see is that they, even though these places are very, very different on this log-log plot, they kind of overlap on top of each other. And this is pretty surprising because, of course, the Yellow River was inhabited much earlier than the Rhine River, probably, especially in terms of how people were affecting the land. And much different, of course, from the Mississippi River, the upper Mississippi River, and, of course, the UK rivers as well. So this was surprising to me. So we actually joined up with Judd Kaplan, who has a model to figure out how much land use people were using, or how much land people were using over different times. And so this is a plot of over different time intervals in Earth's history over the Holocene, the last part of the Holocene, how much land use people were using in these different catchments. And so what we see is that they vary dramatically, and that the amount of land use is not related at all or matching at all, and let me skip ahead one, is not at all matching this rate of sedimentation. So if we think that sedimentation in these floodplains is related to the amount of land use and agricultural practices, then we should see different patterns from place to place, but then there's also no correlation with time and how much land people are actually using to produce the food that they need in different places. So one of the things that we can do about this is if we take like all of the sedimentation rates that Pete Sadler has amassed over his career from floodplains, so alluvial floodplain deposits, and if we think about the duration of averaging of those different floodplain deposits, so this is taking the depth of the sample and just getting the sedimentation rate from that age divided by the depth, okay? And so we see that they all sort of plot on a similar line, and that this similar line is actually giving us similar behavior in lots of different places. And there's all kinds of theoretical explanations for why it would have this specific functional form related to infilling processes of floodplains, etc. I won't go into that. But one of the things I was interested in is, what if we did something else? What if we separated time from the averaging interval, right? That's what we really want to know. We don't want the averaging interval for all of these samples. What we'd rather have is like, if we had a 1,000-year section of time in the early Holocene, would it plot way down here in the early Holocene time period? Or would it plot up here, similar to what it should for 1,000 years of averaging time? But it actually took place in the early Holocene. So we're trying to figure out, what is the effect of averaging time versus time. And so, fortunately, there are some places in this database where people didn't just take one sample at depth, but in fact, and this is just an example from Papua New Guinea, where you could potentially get a carbon datable deposit right here, and then just below it, you might get another carbon datable deposit right here. And so in the same exact core, you might have two time periods. This might be 9,000 years old, this might be 8,000 years old, and so we have an averaging interval of 1,000 years only, but it's in the early Holocene. So what is that giving us? So if I identified all of those different places in this global compilation record and found now, here's that old data set that I showed you before that all plots on top of itself. And here are a select group of early Holocene dates, but where we could actually constrain the averaging interval to be 1,000 years or less, given the radiocarbon, the abilities of radiocarbon dating. And so what we see is that they actually plot where they should according to the averaging duration. So now instead of plotting down here, like they would if they were from the early Holocene up to 0, they actually plot according to their averaging duration with high sedimentation rates compared to low sedimentation rates. So this is telling us that these floodplain deposits that people have been using to infer high rates of erosion and anthropogenic erosion from the increasing rates of sedimentation that they experience might actually be a sign of timescale bias instead. So, just to conclude this part, it creates a couple of problems actually. So some of the problem is what we see in floodplains that we've inferred to be an increase in erosion in recent times is consistent with, but it actually does not require high rates of anthropogenic erosion. And importantly, this doesn't mean that anthropogenic erosion didn't occur. Of course, we have, ways of using our eyes and experiencing anthropogenic erosion happening all the time. But right now, it's very difficult for us to figure out how to measure it in an ideal way where we're actually comparing it to the same baseline rate that same place would experience in the absence of anthropogenic erosion. So this is sort of like a call to arms, I guess, for those of you who are interested in this topic to try to help us work on how would we actually get this rate of anthropogenic erosion if we can't use these settings where we have timescale bias. All right, so that's how much is eroded, and it's a little bit problematic, but now let's switch gears and just say okay, we're eroding a lot. So we can't measure exactly how much, but let's just say we're eroding, maybe 10 to 100 to 1,000 times more than we were in the past. Even though we can't exactly measure it for a specific place, we can see, on that Montgomery diagram that they're just so far outside the norm for soil mantled landscapes that it's clearly happening if we we might need to convince ourselves exactly how much, but probably it's happening. So when we say sustainability, remember, it's partly how fast soil is lost, which is already kind of a hard problem. But then there's also the idea of how fast is that soil replaced. And so for that, we're interested in how fast soil is actually produced from bedrock. And I am kind of ignoring, of course, soil has inputs from below, from the mineral soil, and also from above, from dust, and also sort of swelling of clays, for example, by water, and also fluffing up through density changes by things like roots, and also the addition of carbon, of course. But those above, in most places, except for sort of dryland settings, those above ground inputs are somewhat small compared to the flux from below, especially in places where we have fast erosion rates. So I'm going to ignore the flux from above for the moment and just talk about how geomorphologists or geologists think about how fast soil is replaced from above, or below, I'm sorry. Of course I would mess that up. Okay, so I'm going to introduce the concept of soil production rates and then kind of bring us into Puerto Rico and to try to understand how fast soil is produced in different settings all over the world. So, if we think about soil, most people have different ideas and definitions for soil. So soil scientists will be shocked and horrified by this entire presentation. So what geologists mean when we say this is that there's a mobile regolith at the surface, and it looks something like this. You can see how it has roots, and it's nice and organic, rich, and beautiful. And then below that, we often find something called, but not always, we often find something called saprolite, where we have intact regolith. So it looks like the bedrock parent material. You can see that you can see the individual crystals of biotite. This is a quartz diorite, and this used to be a quartz diorite, but it's experienced a lot of chemical alteration. And this is my student Emma Harrison's photo series. It's just beautiful, and her fingers. These are Emma's fingers. And she has a little chunk of saprolite, and it's sort of intact regolith in that you can see the original crystal structure and orientation in it, but you can actually, she is not a superhuman strong person. She's regular strong, and so she can crush it all by herself, right? Just between her thumb and her finger, and then she gets this mobile business. And so this is what we call soil, this mobile regolith that's been moved around. We don't call this saprolite mobile regolith because it's movable, but it hasn't yet been moved. So you need something like a root or a gopher or a worm or just processes of creep moving it down slope. And that is what we're talking about when we say soil production for the rest of the presentation here. This is just some of these soils, even the mobile regolith can be quite deep sometimes, meters deep. And then at the bottom, this is from Puerto Rico, and this is, at the bottom is just where we get to that intact saprolite. And you can feel it when you are digging with a shovel very clearly. Okay, so there's a theory for how this soil is produced with, and that it depends on soil depth. So on this axis, we have soil production rate, and on this axis, we have soil depth. And so there are a couple of different ideas. This goes back all the way to G.K. Gilbert that said that there was sort of this humped model where there's like a maximum perfect amount of soil that maximizes the rate of soil production, and that this might be related to the ability of soil with a specific thickness to hold in water and to hold plant matter and all kinds of things that are helpful for creating, like growing that mobile regolith thickness. There's also another model, the exponential model for soil production, that says that soil production is really a self-arresting behavior, meaning the thicker the soil, the slower that process is of creating the mobile soil. And this makes a lot of sense in many, many ways, because we don't know of a place on Earth where we have infinitely thick or really, really miles thick soil, right? So something turns it off, right? And at the other end, soil covers between, depending on where you look, between 95 and 98% of the Earth's surface. So it seems like there's something that is increasing the rate of soil production, even when we have some soil that's stripped. So perhaps just stripping soil from the surface increases that rate of soil production. All right, so this was a theory for a long time, and then beryllium-10 came on the scene sort of in the, well, it was around for decades, and then in the 90s, it was used to test this idea of the self-arresting behavior, an exponential decrease of soil production with depth. And one of the ways that we use that, and everybody uses that, is that we measure the amount of beryllium-10 in a sample below the soil saprolite boundary. And one of the assumptions that we use, remember that we can use beryllium-10, just to step back, as the amount of time that it's spent near the Earth's surface, right? So we can actually take a sample from depth, and this star moved over a little bit, I don't know why, but we can take a sample from where this star should have been, over here, and measure sort of the erosion rate, accounting for the fact that our production rate is lower. It's not like the rate that we would experience at the surface. It's a lower production rate because of the overburden of soil. So we have a lower rate of production of beryllium-10, but we think we can account for that using that equation up there, where we have an exponential decrease in production at depth compared to the production at the surface. That's that P naught right there. And that exponential behavior of the production rate of beryllium-10 with depth has been measured a number of times, and it seems like we know it pretty well. So one of the big assumptions in using beryllium-10 is that the erosion rate at the surface, so the ground surface, is eroding, right? And that when this ground surface erodes, this soil saprolite boundary moves and keeps pace with that erosion migration. So you have a little bit of erosion, and at the same time, your soil saprolite boundary is also migrating down. That's one assumption. We'll talk about that more if people are like, that's a crazy assumption. I agree with you. So the soil production rate at depth deviates from that production rate at the surface. And this business in here, this mobile regolith right here, is moving all around. So you could measure beryllium-10 in here too, but if you're on a slope, it could have come from above. Gophers could have been messing with it. So that's why people measure, just take a sample from the saprolite, thinking that it's like staying in place. It's a little bit easier to do so, rather than accounting for the mobility of that soil in that mobile regolith surface, or layer. So here was a wonderful series of papers by Arjun Heimsath in 1997 to 2000, in which case he did this. So he took some sample from depth, calculated soil production rates from that beryllium by assuming a certain, measuring the depth of the soil and calculating a production rate at depth, and then using that to get the soil production rate, and then plotted it according to soil depth. So this is A and B. They're both giving you, this is a log linear plot, so the straight line is giving you an exponential decrease with depth. So it looks like it fits that behavior that of the exponentially decreasing rate of soil production with soil depth. So it seems like it has that self-arresting behavior. So we wanted to look at the rates of soil production in Puerto Rico as well. And so my student, Emma Harrison, now postdoc, Emma Harrison, looking for a job, Emma Harrison. And so she went all over Puerto Rico and collected a bunch of samples at the saprolite soil boundary, and she found nothing like this. Spoiler alert, she didn't find anything like this. And it was a big surprise to us because we thought we had the perfect setting for where we would have that assumption valid, right? We had a place where we thought it was, the landscape was in steady state. It was a very old landscape. And we thought that the rate of soil erosion at the top would match, over time, that rate of deepening of the soil saprolite boundary. So here is the Luquillo Critical Zone Observatory in Puerto Rico. It's in this little area that is sort of pelted by rain. This is kind of an old slide now. It gets a little bit more rain, I guess, than this nowadays that we know better. And this is one of the Rio Blanco. So it's a place, a site, a watershed that is underlain by quartz diorite. So it's really nice for beryllium-10 work because we have ample quartz. And the quartz is sort of from all over, laid all over underneath the soils. And one of the things that you can maybe see on here is this, this different topography up here compared to down here. And so what we discovered, mostly my postdoc Gilles Brocard through a lot of hard work and measuring of different things all over, found that the island actually experienced an uplift event about 4 million years ago, which caused the whole island to tilt. We can trace like an old shore platform down to Pliocene age and some carbonates offshore. And this affected sort of the track of the rivers, of the stream channels. And so if we look at those stream channels in the Rio Blanco watershed, we see that this is the, we have some nice lazy rivers up here above 600 meters elevation. And then we have cascading waterfalls, or nick points we also call them, below 600 meters. And so what's going on is that after the uplift event, we had an initiation of a wave of erosion moving through the landscape, and it increased slopes downstream, and this wave of erosion is still probably propagating through the landscape. And so what we wanted to do, if we're interested in soils, and we want soils that are sort of behaving in a steady manner, is that we went up into this relict area and assumed that soils down here are probably not going to work, with that assumption that the erosion at the surface is matching the rate of the soil saprolite boundary moving down through the soil, because it's definitely out of geomorphic equilibrium. But in the relict landscape, probably is. Like, these streams have been graded to this base level since probably the Pliocene, and down here they're out of equilibrium, but up here we think we have soils in equilibrium. The soils are very thick. We have nice hill slopes, and so we went there to try to figure out the rates of soil production and how they vary with depth. So I mentioned the spoiler alert that there is no relationship with depth. So then we decided to look at the other places on Earth where soil production has been measured and whether they fit, like why Puerto Rico is such an oddball, right? Why it's not matching this exponential soil production versus depth relationship that we thought, like, everywhere else has this relationship, why not us? We were feeling bad. So, so what we found actually is that there are two sort of groups or lumped areas. So in here we have A, which are some places where we have transient landscapes. So they're kind of similar to the downstream portion in Puerto Rico, where they're still perhaps responding to a change in base level, or they are experiencing a rejuvenation in erosion, perhaps through climate or something like that. And in all of these places, these rates of soil production that we measure are lower than the rates that we measure from a stream. So the stream rates are very high, indicating that the soils are not really keeping pace with that sort of landscape rate of erosion that the whole area is experiencing. So that's true for all of these different places all over the world. So this is New Zealand, Tennessee Valley, I have the San Gabriel Mountains in here. And this is very different from places where we have an expectation of that steady landscape behavior occurring. And so these places, Puerto Rico, South Africa, Idaho, Wyoming, the Atacama, are places where we don't get that soil production rate that varies exponentially with soil depth or soil mantle thickness. So over here, we don't have a self-arresting behavior. So this is, for purposes of soil sustainability, this is sort of good and bad, I guess, right? One thing that's good about it is that in some places you have rates of soil production, if we believe these rates, that is, you have rates of soil production that, regardless of how thick your soil is, you're still going to create lots of soil from the underlying soil mantle. Over here, though, one of the hopes for soil sustainability is that when you are measuring these really, really high rates of soil production with thin soils, one hope for the anthropogenic situation is that if we strip off a certain amount of soil, that we're going to sort of rev up that soil production rate, and we're just going to start increasing more production of soil from a thinner soil, right? And so the behavior of these have drastically different sort of, if we play it out for soil sustainability, we have really different behavior in the places that are transient versus the places that are sort of relict landscapes. And one of the things to note is that a lot of the places where we grow our food, for example, are relict landscapes where we don't have this expectation of the behavior. And for a moment, I am ignoring the idea that one of these is wrong for some reason, but that is currently what Emma is doing during her postdoc, is trying to figure out why this group or this group might be wrong, or if they're both right and they just happen to have different behaviors. But it brings up the question, or it begs the question, that if this is not, this soil production rate is not controlled by the thickness of the soil mantle, what's controlling it, right? And I should say that these different colors, so blue to red, are kind of spanning the entire wet to dry sort of gamut. So it doesn't seem like it's totally related to soil moisture. So one of the things that it could be is getting out of steady state, but I'm running out of time and I want to leave it open for questions. So I'm going to actually skip this slide and go to conclusions of part 2, that we assume / hope that soil production will keep up with soil erosion. But for many places on Earth, this actually might not be the case. And importantly, this doesn't mean that soil production can't keep pace, but we don't really know the controls on soil production yet. So this is still something that is an ongoing question that we are working on, and we'd love for other people to work on too. So with that, I will say thank you to the National Science Foundation for funding and for having the privilege of talking to you today. So thank you very much. Happy to take questions.
Great talk, Jane. I believe Dan Richter asked when the uplift was occurring in Luquillo.
Oh, about 4 million years ago. So there are a series of caves that were previously at sea or around sea level and are now quite high up in the landscape. And they have abandoned fluvial networks that, and the sediment inside those fluvial networks can be burial dated using aluminum and beryllium. By the way, Dan, I owe you an email. I'm so sorry. So we have gotten those burial ages back from all of these different caves, and those caves have ages of about 4 million years. So the whole island of Puerto Rico is on a subduction zone, so it's probably fair to say it had something related to plate reorganization, probably associated with that subduction. But 4 million years is the quick answer to that.
And Joan Marie asked, can you explain a little more the normalization of the sedimentation rate in your part 1 intersite comparison?
Oh, that was just to get it onto the same axis. It doesn't really matter. Like if I didn't normalize the rates, it would just look like this. Like the high rate would, the Yellow River has the highest sedimentation rates, and it would look like this with the same slope. And then the others would have the same slope, but lower sort of maximum rates. And I just normalized them to get them to nicely plot on top of one another. but the rates for the like global average, those are not normalized in any way. So those are just the straight rates. Maybe I should get rid of that normalization. It just messes people up. But I'm not doing anything funny. It just makes them plot on top of each other. And I think that one of the reasons that they don't naturally plot on top of each other is just the sediment flux moving through those different rivers sets a different maximum sedimentation rate for the different areas. Good question. I promise I'm not hiding anything with the normalization.
Here we have another. If anyone wants to raise their hand, I'd be happy to unmute you. Maria asked, when assessing anthropogenic erosion, is it only due to land management or also by climate warming and intensifying the hydrologic cycle?
Oh, good question. Yeah. So that's a hard one to answer, and I would say that we don't know exactly. There was just a paper that came out that was talking about how you know, a lot of papers in the past had assumed that the amount of sediment that actually reached the ocean was significantly decreased by, for example, dams that are put in. And there was just a paper, I forget where it was, like it was a big journal like Nature or Science or something like that, where they actually measured in the Mississippi Delta and found that even though there's all kinds of damming that goes on along that river system, that the water actually then just picks up more sediment downstream of that. I wish I could remember more details of it, but it just picked up more sediment downstream of those dams. So the ways that we, you know, we're still learning about how humans are affecting sediment and the effect of climate on soil production and transport of material out of the system. And I think that that's probably still an open question. But I can send you some references. If you send me an email, I'll send you a couple like really interesting references where they've tackled that.
Can you see the chat box, Jane?
Like the Q&A or the chat box?
Oh, is she frozen or am I frozen? The chat box. You got a couple in the queue there.
Oh, so Thanos says, have you looked into floodplain depot centers or just river bar depot centers? So all the data from the sedimentation rates stuff that I presented in part 1, that was all from floodplains. And then when we were measuring beryllium-10 in rivers, we actually did measure some beryllium-10 in the floodplain, that Fajardo floodplain that I showed you. And that's one potential way forward in the future, is not looking at the amount of sediment preserved in these floodplains, but actually the beryllium-10, like either in or absorbed to the sediment that's in the floodplain. We have a paper that's submitted on those erosion rates in that Fajardo floodplain. But that's one thing that we'd like to explore more to see if we could do that more. And then there's also ways of getting like paleo erosion rates from beryllium-10 to look at erosion rate changes over time, and that's been done by various people looking at like Holocene versus present. And it looks kind of like the gauging data too. It's like sometimes it's higher, sometimes it's lower. There's just a paper that came out that shows that like the Ganges Brahmaputra has been like about the same for millions of years. So we're still learning about what actually perturbs river systems, but that's a really great question. Dan, did you have another question? I see you.
Yeah, I appreciate your talk, Jane. It was really interesting, both parts. Um, at the Calhoun, which is we have historic constraints on our agriculturally accelerated erosion. We've thought in terms of the floodplains representing, less than 5% of watersheds. So, and I don't know if that fraction means a lot to us, particularly to the fact that our legacy sediments pile up to 1, 2, 3 meters, 5 meters.
Yeah.
And it's because you mentioned this funnel effect. Now it's also got me thinking that the more about sediment as being, these are particles now in motion, a lot more than they were in the past, and they'll continue to be in this fluvial system over and over again. And I don't know how these sediment studies actually date the deposits in such a clean way, given that, the sediment particles will be picked up again and moved downstream. And I guess that has to do with making sure you get the base of the deposit straight.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of, tricky things with using radiocarbon for floodplain deposits too,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And then lead-210 also has its own, foibles. Not with the measurements themselves, but how you actually turn them into an age that, haven't really been looked at. Everybody kind of just cites that paper from 1967, and I know a lot of people don't even want to touch lead because it's hard. You have to make a lot of really tough assumptions when you're doing lead dating. And so I think that's something that would also be good to look into is how well we really can constrain these different rates. One time I found a belt buckle in a sediment deposit in a floodplain in Minnesota, and it was from you flipped it over and it was from 1978, and it was 3 meters down, and it was just like, how did this get here? I mean, this is a really great it's a really great time indicator, but I wish we just had buried belt buckles everywhere. Yeah, your comment is well taken though about the 5% business. That's probably accounting for a lot of the huge orders of magnitude difference in rates of sedimentation versus erosion.
So I know we're at the top of the hour, but Jane, you have quite a number of questions lined up. So I'm going to try to get to at least a couple of them before everyone logs off here. Nelson asked, how difficult was it to separate the mobile soil from saprolite in highly weathered thick soils? His question is, it says, similar to what we have here in southeastern Brazil. Can it be a factor to explain the lack of soil depth effects?
Oh, I missed the first part. Well, I don't see that one.
If you open the chat box.
Oh, the chat box. Oh, okay.
There's 2 different boxes here.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
I'll let Jane.
Oh, how difficult was the mobile soil from the saprolite? It's not hard at all there. So that was one of the things that is harder in some places. Like if you have soil, underlying bedrock that doesn't clearly have a fabric where you can see if it's mobile or not mobile. And so that wasn't seemingly a problem for us in Puerto Rico, but some places it can be hard. One of the things that I didn't have time to get into is that it is tricky to figure out, the time averaged depth that a soil has accumulated its beryllium-10. So if you have a transient landscape and you just chop off the top part of the soil column, your depth that you measure instantaneously, when you're sampling your soil, is going to be wrong. And that actually creates an artifact where you sort of get out of it a soil production rate versus depth that seems exponential, but might not actually be so. So that's one of the things we're working on right now, is just to see if in these transient landscapes, if the exponential soil production function is actually just an artifact of the method that we're using, which would be crazy, but also good to know. Do they use beryllium-7? People have used beryllium-7. That decays over a very short amount of time, so it's only around for about a year. People have used beryllium-7, though, to get the redistribution of sediment, for example, behind dams. Nira Salant and Marwan Hassan did that to look at like the remobilization of beryllium-7 dead material and how it moves downstream. But it's tricky because you have to measure something that's not there, which means that your statistics are really tricky. But they've used beryllium-7 for that point. What are the geomorphological signatures of the Relict landscape shown in part 2? So some of the places we can just see that there are abrupt changes in slope. Sometimes there are nick points that we can identify. But one of the things that I find personally convincing is the fact that the rates of basin-wide erosion are often, 2 times higher than the rates of soil production, which in an equilibrium, like a geomorphically equilibrium landscape, they should probably match, right? Your rates of creation of soil or soil erosion should match your rate of mass flux out of the system. And so they match in the panels where there were flat soil production rates, and the stream erosion rates were always higher in the other where you had an exponential rate of soil production. Let's see one. Let's see, Jamie had a question. The rate scales are different. Is there anything to make of the overall rates being lower in the non-conforming soils? Yeah, they are just generally, maybe an order of magnitude or not quite lower in the non-conforming soils. And so, my take on that is just that in places where you have active uplift, you might be more likely to have a transient landscape. And the places where we have sort of flat soil production functions are places where you don't have as active uplift. But some places are separated by, there are a couple of different sites in the Sierra Nevada CZO, and one of them is above what I would call the suggesting landscape, and one is below. The one that's below looks exponential, and the one that's above looks flat. So the Providence Creek soil production rates don't really depend on depth very much. So even in the same sort of place, you can get very different behavior upstream and downstream of the wave of erosion moving through. Yeah, I would say though that on Earth, most places probably are that lower rate of erosion, not the higher rate of erosion. So, let's see. Do I have any research in Africa as facing problems of famine as a result of maybe climate change impact and stuff? Yeah, so I would love to. One of the places that I thought would be really neat to do a study is Ethiopia, for example, because there they've had agriculture for thousands of years, and so it'd be really interesting to see the impact in a place that has experienced agriculture for so long, and to compare it against an early Holocene rate to see what the actual impact of terracing and agriculture was there. But alas, that proposal was not funded. But that would be really great to look at, you know, places that have experienced anthropogenic impact for a long time, what their erosion rates are, what the differences are. If their soil production rates are not self-regulate, what regulates them, in my opinion? Earthquakes and tectonics, temperature, rock dissolution. I don't know. I don't know. It seems like there's something related to, like it does seem like the rates that are the highest are also places that get the most rain. So Puerto Rico in that Relict zone are some of the highest rates. But then Idaho is right up there with Puerto Rico, and that is quite cold, right? So it might be frost cracking in Idaho and not frost cracking in Puerto Rico. And then in New Zealand, you get very, very high rates, and there you get lots of rain, but also all kinds of other stuff, right? Like earthquakes. So this is still an open question. Like why, what sets that maximum rate of soil production, and how long after a perturbation do we actually experience a change in soil production? That's something that is also unknown. And I should add that, like, one way that you might think that you would approach that question is through modeling, but in a modeling environment, you have to impose some rule for how soils are created. And so far, people use an exponentially decreasing rate of soil production with depth, and so, or with soil depth. And so it's really hard to figure out what the soils are doing if we now think that maybe this exponential rate is not exactly valid. But good question. That would be great thing to figure out. How can you estimate erosion in sites without much quartz? So people can use like LiDAR and things like that for the recent rates. Some people are trying to do things with like helium-3 in olivine for like the Hawaiian Islands. People are trying, like we used meteoric beryllium-10 in the Fajardo floodplain. But it's easiest when there's quartz, but of course there's also like assumptions that go into cosmogenic nuclide work. So just having quartz is not does not guarantee you a good rate. You also have to not violate those assumptions that you make. Great. Well, thank you all.
11 minutes past the hour. So thank you for getting through all those questions, Jane. Everybody stuck around. So that's
Awesome.
indicative of a great talk. And I'm sorry we didn't get to Mohammed. He wanted to speak, but I'm sure if you DM Jane or send her an email, she'd be happy to follow up. But thank you so much. That was a great talk. Great questions, everyone. And thank you for attending.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.